Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this virtual Guardian Live event. I'm Lexi Topping. I'm a senior news reporter here at The Guardian, and I'm going to be your chair for the next 60 minutes. Together with our really genuinely excellent panel, we're going to be assessing the damage that the past year has done to gender equality. But more importantly than that, we're going to be looking at ways that how we can stop the clock being turned back, both as individuals and collectively. I really want this to be a really positive, solutions-focused session. So if you don't think we're doing that, do let us know in the comments. I hope we won't disappoint you. I'd like to start and introduce our guests. So let's meet the panel. First, Ortega Wagba is the writer of the best-selling book, Little Black Book, a toolkit for working women, and the forthcoming We Need to Talk About Money. She's a vocal advocate for women's equality in the workplace and full of amazing practical advice to encourage women to have a better working life and a better financial life. I personally credit her with the fact that I got the last pay rise that I asked for. And so if you don't own the Little Black Book, buy it. Buy it for your girlfriends. Buy it for everyone you know. It is a very astute investment. Next up, we have Labour MP Stella Creasy. She's been the Labour MP for Walthamstow since 2010. She campaigns on, frankly, all sorts of things, but particularly women's rights and equality, and most recently pushing to make misogyny a hate crime. Stella, rather delightfully, is known as a troublemaker in the House of Commons, but for all the right reasons. She is, according to The Economist, an enterprising backbencher who has an astonishing ability to use amendments and loopholes and basically whatever it takes to get what she wants. And quite often she is campaigning for the same things that right-thinking people want all over this country. So we're delighted to have her with us tonight. And finally, Joelle Briley is the founder of Pregnant Then Screwed, an organisation that fights against pregnancy and maternity discrimination faced by women at work. If you've read any of my stories ever, you will know that Joelle is an incredible font of knowledge. She set up Pregnant Then Screwed after being sacked by voicemail the day after she told her boss that she was pregnant. So, you know, while the rest of us were kind of busy puking up our cornflakes, Joelle set up this incredible campaigning organisation. And I've covered gender equality for a long time, but I can honestly say I've never met a more effective campaigner than Joelle. She's a force of nature. I'm delighted she's with us too. So thank you all for being here. I hope I didn't make you rush too much. I did promise I would. A little bit of housekeeping just before we get properly started. Some of you have sent really great questions in for the panel. Thank you very much for that. If you'd like to put a question forward at any point, you can totally do so using the question and answers box. You also have the option to like other people's questions, so do that as well, and we'll get through as many of the favourites as we can. So, with no further ado, I want to launch into this discussion. Although I want this to be very solutions focused, we can't really do that unless we look at the damage that has been wreaked on gender equality in the past year. You know, we've seen, to name a few, women more likely to be furloughed, more likely to lose their jobs, more likely to carry the burden of homeschooling and domestic drudgery. So it's little wonder that women are feeling fearful about their futures. Half of respondents in a Mundnet survey found that half of women in a Mundnet survey thought that women's equality was in danger of going back to the 1970s. I have no desire for that. But Stella, what are we all moaning about? Was it really that bad this year?
Well, I mean, I'd love to go back to sort of the 1970s fashion, but I think actually I'm worried we're going back to the 1950s in terms of the attitudes. Look, gender inequality is not a new thing. I think what has been shocking about the pandemic is how quickly and the pace of reversal and the kind of default position that has been that when things got difficult, women would pick up the slack. If we're going to talk about the 1970s, one of my favourite quotes, which is always attributed to Gloria Steinem, so I shall give it to her, is that the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off a bit. We know from the research that's been done over the last year just how bad things have got for women. My actual favourite stat is that for every 1 productive hour a woman has been able to have at home, men have had 3. What does that mean in practice? It means, as you said, women have been taking on the lion's share of homeschooling, of homework, but also trying to keep their jobs together. And as a consequence, it is understandable why an awful lot of women in this country are very, very, the polite term for it is frazzled, but burnt out from trying to manage both an insecure workplace, because obviously we know prior to the pandemic, a lot of women were in insecure work in the first place, with also all the added pressures that come from being asked to take on all the unpaid work that needs to happen in our society. And I think that's a really important thing to recognise here, is that these trends are not new, but the idea that somehow we would pick up the slack, somehow women would take on the homeschooling, looking after a house, making things work for people, caring for people who might be ill with COVID, was just a given. And I think that was the most shocking thing for all of us. It wasn't even a conversation, it wasn't even up for debate. It was just laid out, and the evidence now shows us that women have lost their jobs in droves. They were much more likely to be furloughed, so they're much more likely to be at the front of redundancy. I don't want to steal Jolie's thunder because she's absolutely font of knowledge in all of this, but also in terms of the discrimination they face in the workplace. And they've also had to pick up all the slack that comes from trying to homeschool your kids and trying to make caring arrangements work, not just for children, but also for older relatives. And as we know from the Mail, they've been blamed either way for doing it or not doing it. So I think it's that sense that we literally couldn't win, but it wasn't even a conversation about whether that would be an acceptable thing to happen. It just did.
Absolutely. And Jolie, I want to bring you in here because, you know, your work focuses on pregnancy discrimination, but also on motherhood. How bad has the last year been for pregnant women?
Oh, well, so in terms of pregnancy and maternity discrimination, the number of women that were pushed out of their jobs for daring to procreate had almost doubled in 10 years before the pandemic. So things were already drastically deteriorating. They weren't improving. And of course, as with every type of discrimination and bias, it went on steroids during the pandemic. So we were seeing women were contacting us who were pregnant, they were being made redundant, and they said everybody in their office that was pregnant was being made redundant, and that's the only group of people that were being made redundant. And the same with women that were returning from maternity leave. They were being pushed out of their jobs in their droves. We don't know the exact statistics of how many mothers have left the workforce, but our research with 20,000 mothers found that about 15% said they either had been made redundant or they expected to be made redundant. And it was just under half said the reason they were being made redundant was because of childcare issues, which is really shocking because they obviously knew why they were being pushed out of their jobs. They knew it was discrimination. In terms of pregnant women, of course, it's been an entirely different scenario in that they have had massive health and safety risks. So before the pandemic, 4% of pregnant women left their job because of health and safety risks. We don't know the statistics, but it is enormous. Women were being forced to choose between their livelihoods and their health and the health of their unborn child. And this was particularly prevalent for Black, Asian and ethnically diverse women. They were being put in really dangerous situations, and if they were being suspended from work, they were often on no pay, or they were being forced to take their maternity leave early, or they were on sick pay.
Ortega, do you think that there's been a kind of recognition of this? Are we even there yet, where there's a recognition of how bad it's been? I mean, I'm talking at government level, but more widely across society.
I think we're kind of still catching up. I remember it was in the headlines a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember whether it was either Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson who kind of made this statement saying thanks to all the women. But what really irritated, thanks to all the women for picking up the slack. But what really irritated me about that is that it was presented in this really sort of warm, cozy way, as opposed to recognizing the fact that the reason women and particularly mothers had to pick up the slack within the home was because the government doesn't provide adequate policies, adequate childcare, any of the things that would have allowed women to sort of, carry on living their lives as close to normally as possible. And I just found it quite disingenuous because women have lost out economically, emotionally, as a result of having to pick up the slack within homes, but also within the workplace. So I found that just really jarring. And I also think something to consider is, the pay gap reporting, because obviously that's been delayed by a bit. I'm really, really adamant that pay gap reporting needs to happen regardless. We need to carry on tracking the data throughout this period so that we can really show and appreciate the full scale of women's losses, because a lot of the studies that have been happening, whilst very robust, they're only a partial picture of the economy, whereas with the pay gap reporting, it's every company above 250 employees, so we're much more, and because it's mandatory, we're much more likely to get a much better picture of what's going on. And if it does need to account for the fact that a certain number of people have been furloughed, a certain number of people have been made redundant, then absolutely do that, because again, it will show that the people who have been furloughed and made redundant more so have been women, have been ethnic minorities, and we need that on the record, essentially.
I absolutely agree. And actually, one of our viewers tonight, Shada Dean, sent in this really brilliant question, I thought. She's an economics teacher at an all-girls school, and she asks, what one piece of simple advice should I be offering my students in order to bulletproof their future careers from the gender pay gap? And I thought, oh, Ortega would like that. Let's go. What would you say to Shada?
I mean, I really wish I had a silver bullet for that. Because obviously so many of the issues are structural and, out of individual women's or individual teenage girls' control. One thing I would say, and it's interesting that this question came from an economics teacher, because I studied economics at A-level and then at university. And something that has always, I would say that you need to encourage the girls you're teaching to become comfortable with negotiating and debating. Because when you get into the workplace and you are trying to negotiate and debate over pay, over responsibility, over power, over any one of those things, if you are used to doing that and used to advocating for yourself, whether it's through a debate club at school, whether it's through negotiation workshops, I honestly would recommend starting that. That will really stand you in good stead. And it's funny that it's an economics teacher, because I use game theory, the idea of game theory a lot in my negotiations, obviously at a really low level, but that kind of the mentality of how people respond to each other when something is at stake or when they have something to win or lose or benefit from. I use that all the time just instinctively, but I think giving your students a grounding in game theory, and I'm pretty sure it's part of the curriculum, but giving them a grounding in game theory and how that can be applied to real life situations, I think is really important, because the things that we can do that are in our power are negotiation. And you can get better at negotiation. Like, it's something you can skill up on. So that is kind of what I'd recommend kind of teaching teenage girls these days.
Amazing. So I want to go from the micro to the macro. Let's look at bigger picture, and let's look at those structural inequalities that you were talking about. Let's talk politics. Our guest Emma Perry said tonight that there was considerable optimism at the start of the pandemic about women's leadership. We were kind of told that women were doing this better if there was such a thing. Do you think that we've lost that sense of optimism, or even just the fact that we're talking about it? Or how do we kind of optimize that sense that female leaders did do very well at the start of this pandemic? Stella, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the contrast was very clear in terms of people like Jacinta Ardern leading from the front and being very visible as a leader, and the fact that literally no women were put forward to talk to the British public. And frankly, I would argue that that's not just an issue with the government. I mean, I'm not here to suggest there's a partisan nature to this, but it was very noticeable that literally no women were part of the nightly press conferences about what was happening in our country, and also that the decisions that were being made. I mean, I would be with Ortega about actually training people in negotiation work. I also think, and my background is psychology, we have to change that conversation ourselves that we'll often have, that somehow if we speak up on things, we're being difficult. We're not being difficult, we're being different. And it was very noticeable, the sameness of the people being brought out time and time again to tell you what was going on, and somehow that was reassuring. And it was reinforcing the idea that this was effective government because it spoke to what people knew. I think we have to demand better. I mean, the thing that's really telling about the gender pay gap issue is it was the only piece of business reporting that the government cancelled during the pandemic. Every other piece of business reporting, businesses were required to continue doing. So somehow, you were still being made to find the paperwork on all manner of corporate governance issues, but not on how you were treating your employees and the impact that would have on our economy. And one of the conversations I would love to change is too often the way in which, because it is men in government who talk about it, is they talk about the gender pay gap as though they're doing us a favour to record this. We don't recognise that closing the gender pay gap, and indeed closing the ethnicity pay gap, because a couple of years ago the government promised to also start monitoring that, was about cold hard economics. We've just had 10 years of austerity in this country. We've now spent a huge amount of money to try and keep things going during the pandemic. We know that closing the gender pay gap would add £600 billion to our economy by 2025. If there was ever a time to give up on austerity economics and to actually look at what invests in people and unlocks productivity and can help you out of a situation like a pandemic, it is now. And yet still we're seeing gender pay gap and issues around equality as kind of optional extra. And I think that's what the issue is about, both in having women in office. I mean, I actually feel very strongly and quite powerfully that we shouldn't talk just about having women in the room, because then we put the pressure on the women in the room to be the every woman. And, I learned that most from Margaret Thatcher, who used to complain about being in the shadow cabinet and being the only woman there and being asked to speak for every woman. Women are not some homogenous lump with similar views and similar experiences and similar ideas. We're a bit like men, we're quite different. And so the idea that it's just enough to have women in the room, it's not. It's about asking what is missing. And what was missing from our leadership, and has been missing from our leadership in politics and in business and indeed in the media, has been that diversity of thought and diversity of opinion. And it's very telling that when it came to a pandemic, other countries that were more diverse, just as businesses that are more diverse, did better. And the whole point about equality for me is there's a cold hard economic logic there that says that countries that are more diverse are more resilient, both financially and socially. And when you're facing something like a pandemic, that resilience really, really matters. And we've seen the impact as a result.
Jodie, I'd like to bring you in here because you are absolutely amazing at holding the government's feet to the fire. And one of our viewers here tonight is saying, well, how do we hold the government to account for failing to protect and support the rights of women this year?
It's a very, very good question. I mean, you can take them to court, which we did. There are judicial reviews. The court system is available to you, and yes, it's challenging to do and it's expensive, but it is available, and I don't think we use that system enough. We took the government to court over the self-employed income support scheme because the way the scheme was calculated, it discriminated against women, because if you'd taken a period of maternity leave, you received a payment that was far less than your male counterparts. We lost the case. We're now going to...
If I remember, Jolie, people take breaks, career breaks, for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, well, I mean, they could be going on holiday, Lexi. So
it's
similar.
just the same as producing a human.
Yeah, it's just like maternity leave. There's that system available. I mean, it's challenging to hold the government to account because, as we know, there are a lot of Conservatives in the government, in the Parliament at the moment. But you can make change happen, and part of that is by working with groups who have a following, so you can make some noise. And so, find issues that you are passionate about and make sure you have those issues really well thought through, so you have solutions to those issues. Get your local MP involved, talk to them about it, and then bring in other groups that have a following, talk to them about the issue, and write letters to MPs, try and get 10-minute rule bills read in Parliament, talk to brilliant MPs like Stella Creasy about some of the parliamentary processes that you can use in order to get your voice heard. And you've just got to keep going. You've got to be really tenacious. You've got to get journalists behind you. And you've got to get as many MPs behind you as possible. But we have seen that change is possible. We've managed to change guidance and tweak some legislation as a result of just not giving up and getting the right people behind us who will support us, and women supporting us as well.
Yeah, we are legion, aren't we? And you know, the thing is, we're also really tired because we're doing all this unpaid care work. But I really strongly believe that, you know, and you've shown, and your work shows, that when 20,000 people, you know, reply to a survey done by Pregnant and Screwed, that's an astonishing piece of evidence at just how badly things are going wrong. So, you know, thank you for the work that you do on that. I want to move to unpaid care work, actually. I'm conscious that we're getting on a bit, because it's such a vital part of what we're talking about here, isn't it? And it really struck me the other day that just how crazy this country is when it comes, well, let's start with childcare. My friend's sister is a primary school teacher. We kind of need them. They're quite important. But she's giving up work when she has her second baby because she literally can't afford to pay for 2 children under 3 to be in childcare. It's more than her wages for that to happen. So, Jolie, I know I've just spoken to you, but I'd love to kind of focus. This is such a big issue, but I want to kind of stay quite focused. What 1 or 2 things does the government need to do to tackle this? And what advice for individuals facing this kind of terrifying mountain of costs in the early years? What have you got any advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because if you've got a child that is under school age and you want to go to school and you haven't got family close by, you need somebody looking after them. You can't leave them in a jumperoo with a packet of beef flavoured hula hoops watching Peppa Pig and think they'll be fine, because they just won't be. So we do need good quality, cost effective childcare in order for parents to be able to work, and inevitably it's women to be able to work. And our research before the pandemic found that 1/3 of mothers say they either pay to go to work, it costs them to go to work, or they just break even. And so inevitably lots of women think, well, what is the point? Like, why am I actually working to pay for somebody else to look after my child that I had because I wanted, and I wanted to spend time with them? So this is a big cause of the gender pay gap. And the way that our funding model for childcare works doesn't make any sense, because the 30 hours free, I'll put that in inverted commas because it's not free, it's subsidised, only kicks in when a child is 3 years old, at which point you've fallen out of the workforce. You've gone if you can't afford it. So why on earth are we then giving free childcare to people who can afford the childcare in the first place? The whole system just doesn't make sense. And we know that for every £1 invested in childcare, you get £3 back. And yet the government is just repeatedly ignoring this. And all they seem to care about at the moment is construction, despite the Women's Budget Group showing that for every £1 you invest in care, you create 2.7 times as many jobs as you do if you make the same investment in construction. The countries, including the United States and Canada, have realised this recently. The pandemic has highlighted how absolutely imperative it is that we have a functioning childcare system for everybody. They've started investing money in the childcare system so it's affordable. What we have done is increased the cost of childcare and reduced the funding to the childcare sector. So in December, the government, in their wisdom, decided that it would make sense to start subsidising childcare based on current occupancy levels rather than pre-pandemic occupancy levels. Now, of course, the kids are at home because, you know, family members may have COVID, they're furloughed, they're worried about their children being in the childcare system. So the numbers of kids in childcare is reduced by about 1/3. So they've actually just gone and cut more funding to the childcare sector, and that means we're going to lose loads of our nurseries. But to move on to what you can do, I mean, it is kind of difficult. You're between a rock and a hard place, but there is tax-free childcare and lots of people don't know it exists. So apply for tax-free childcare. You will want to throw your computer out of the window because the system is so purposefully clunky. It makes you want to scream, but do apply for it. A brilliant woman called Nicola Salvato took the government to court over universal credit. You used to have to pay for childcare and then you got the money back if you're on universal credit. And of course, you don't have any money if you're on universal credit. Thankfully, she won her case, though soon you won't have to pay for childcare up front if you're on universal credit. And then, of course, you get the 30 hours when it kicks into 3 years old. But try and use friends and family as much as you can, and try and, you know, if you've got a flexible employer, try and do stuff with your partner if you have one, so that you can use childcare as little as possible, so it doesn't absolutely cripple you.
Yeah, I would also say we shouldn't be accepting this as a nation. We shouldn't be accepting this as women. It's not acceptable that we are in a situation where people have to pay to go to work. So, you know, even though this has always been the case, it's the case now. It may feel like it's going to be the case forever. It doesn't have to be. So, you know, the whole thing that Jolie was saying about lobbying your MP and making a noise about it, I think is really important on this issue. But we forget.
It's not even feminism, this is just good economics. Like, it is just good economics to invest in our childcare system, and yet it's a woman's issue and it's being ignored.
Well, that's what I was about to say. I do think we need to think about both on a kind of interpersonal level within relationships, and I don't have children, but I'm just kind of observing how my friends who do have children are kind of operating with their relationships. And then on a wider level, this isn't just a women's issue. Like, these children have fathers as well, but it's treat the entire burden of, you know, childcare, looking after childcare. It's always kind of put under women's issue. This is a society-wide issue, which is why I think both at an interpersonal level and at a more structural level, we also kind of need to change the narrative around it being something that women need to find a way around, because this is something that partners, parents need to find a way around. And it's probably easier said than done, because also when you look at the gender pay gap, often, you know, one of the reasons that women did fall out of the workforce so much during the pandemic is because often the male-female relationship, the man earns more. So financially, it makes sense for the woman to be the one who sits out and takes care of the kids. But I do think there also needs to be, you know, if your male partner is a feminist, there also needs to be a conversation about how you manage, you know, childcare in a way where your career is not the only one affected. And obviously there are certain biological imperatives, I'm not denying that, but I think it can't be cordoned off as a women's issue anymore, because it takes two to tango, essentially.
I absolutely agree with that. Chip in.
But, well, what is really frustrating about this is that actually the answers, and you asked us to be solution focused, Lexi, are already there. It just takes a political will to do it. Take maternity leave. I actually had to cut short my maternity leave for my first child because the pandemic hit, and I didn't feel it was fair to ask the woman who was covering my job to deal with the impact of a pandemic on my local community. But I was lucky to have maternity cover and to be able to actually to make maternity cover happen for 6 months. In the last year, the only piece of legislation the government has passed on maternity cover was to give maternity cover to members of the cabinet. And I've said I will take the government to court because I'm pregnant again. I don't have proper maternity cover clarified as yet still for my second child, should be due in September, but also because there are thousands of women in this country who are not able to make that choice and be comfortable and confident that their career will still be on track if they go back. And you are right to take it. This is not, you know, I did biology at school. There are definitely two people involved in making a baby. So the responsibility needs to be equal. In other countries, shared parental leave is not something as a preserve for the rich. It's actually properly funded. I think it's really important we talk about the gender pay gap to recognise it's about a third of the gender pay gap, women having children. So there's a big old chunk of blatant discrimination and stereotypes about women and what they're capable of. But there's also an awful lot of women who've been paying tax. And one of the things I would say is that there is a big unclaimed amount of money when it comes to the child tax credit, that the payment towards childcare that you can have. A lot of people don't know it exists, that Jolie was talking about, so they don't claim it, such that there is enough money, and there should be enough money in the Treasury coffers to cover the cost of investing in our childcare system so that it doesn't fall apart during the pandemic. This is particularly an inequality issue because it's in poorer communities where it's been more affluent parents who have subsidised childcare that you've been able to keep childcare settings open. So when the money's gone, it'll be in poorer areas that will lose the nurseries first. I've raised that with the Chancellor. As ever, when talking about childcare in Parliament, it sometimes feels like you're talking Klingon, in that you said the word childcare and then they just kind of blank out because they don't really understand anything else that you're talking about. So they'll say something nice and important about how it is good to give people options. And we are right about wanting to give options. But we know the policies that work. We know that gender pay gap reporting and indeed gender requirements make a difference on these issues. We know that shared parental leave, paid parental leave, and proper provision of care make a difference. The thing that was most disheartening when it came to discussing that maternity bill that was brought forward in Parliament is, frankly, more people cared about whether the word mother was used than the mothers who weren't being offered the same kind of support and care that we were offering to very wealthy people in our cabinet system. That was back in February. The government promised me at that point that they were conducting a review. We've been promised that there'll be a maternity task force. That was promised in 2019. Zero things are happening. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't talk to your MP if your MP's in Walthamstow, right? Because I promise you, I get this and I'm on it until I hope my second period of maternity leave. But please do raise it, because it's only when those voices are raised and we say, well, hang on a minute. We're not just asking for your sympathy that, oh, it's difficult and complicated and do you have family nearby? We know from other countries what works. We know the economic benefit of doing this. Why on earth are you not investing in your people in this country? Why do you not value what we do? Why is it you offer me a pat on the head and talk about nannies, and that genuinely has happened to me in Parliament, but you don't look at the bottom line, which is the loss to our economy, the loss of that talent that comes from people dropping out of the workforce because it's the only way to make things work. As I say, why wasn't this a conversation in the pandemic? It wasn't, but it can be now as we go back.
Yeah, let's make some noise. I think, slightly staying on that topic, but also drilling down on this idea that it is not a women's issue. This is not, and it's not a parenting issue, right? This does affect all of us. We are, producing decent childcare for the taxpayers of the future is also quite important, even if you look at it from an economic point of view. But I wanted to ask this question that we got in from Sue Kedgley, which I loved, and I'm a little bit sad that I can't discuss it with Sue over a glass of white wine afterwards, nicely warmed as we usually do after these events. Sue asks, isn't it a large part of the problem that women have undergone a great deal of change in the past 50 years? They've been busy questioning their role, redefining what it means to be a woman, but men have largely stood still. How do we encourage men to change and question outdated and toxic models of masculinity? I think this is really, really key to what we're talking about here. And we are perhaps at a moment of opportunity, right? So during the lockdown, there was a big increase in the amount of childcare that men were doing. Someone called Alexandra Topping wrote, the first COVID lockdown led to a 58% increase in childcare undertaken by men, whose working hours dropped by an hour and 37 minutes a day. So while women, let's not forget, we're still doing more, but the care gap narrowed. Ortega, how do we capitalize on that, and how do we make that the norm? Or make that just the start?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking, this is maybe slightly flippant, but as a single 30-year-old woman, my solution is to just not date the bad ones. But I mean, I really do feel like it's about just not. I think about this a lot because I'm at that age where I'm starting to think about what my future might hold in terms of family, marriage, partner, all that sort of thing. And it's very clear to me that I can't entertain men who I get the impression have retrograde values about family or childcare and that sort of thing. So like on a slightly jokey level, I do really think, and it's something that my girlfriends and those of them who are married discuss a lot. Like I'm quite heartened actually talking to some of my girlfriends who have long-term partners and who are married, because the gender chore gap at least is very evenly split, and I think that's partly to do with the fact that we're quite an ardently feminist bunch, and I do hope that it's slightly a generational thing and that the norms and the expectations are changing and hopefully changing out. But also, I mean, in terms of toxic masculinity and changing gaps and changing sort of roles within society, I think there's a real responsibility. And, this came up during the really tragic case of Sarah Everard. There's a real responsibility for men to talk to other men, because, again, it is often kind of painted as the responsibility of women to kind of pass this issue of, how do we encourage men to adopt more progressive values? But men need to be having these conversations with each other, and I think they probably resound more if they're coming from other men. So this means talking to your father, your grandfather, your son, your brother, your friends. Like I do think that I have hope and I have faith in men, and I think that they need to be holding each other to much higher account. So that for me is, I think, where at least part of the solution lies.
Jolie, do you want to add anything to that?
I love Sue's question. I don't necessarily think I agree with it, though. I do think men have been on a massive journey over the last 50 years, as well as women. And I mean, we all know women who are wholly cooperative members of the patriarchy, don't we? I know loads of them. And certainly what we do, we hear as many stories about women getting rid of other women as we do men getting rid of other women in work. And it was a woman that sacked me. So I do think men are going on a interesting journey themselves. And, as a mother of boys, I feel that is a massive responsibility. And I think it's really important that we ask our sons what kind of fathers they want to be, not just girls, what kind of mothers they want to be. And we model really good relationships in the home, so we don't fulfill those gender stereotypes, so that's not what they get used to. There is a brilliant app called Our Home, which me and my partner use, and it gamifies the housework. And if you have a really competitive partner like I do, it's perfect. You can add points for different bits of housework that you do, and it gets them going. So I would highly recommend that. And I agree with what Ortega said. Men should be talking to other men about this. And I think actually some of them do, not all of them. You have the bad eggs, but I do think men are starting to have more of these conversations between themselves. And if we look at what happened in Iceland, the most gender equal country in the world, in the 70s, all the women went on strike, didn't they? And they just said, right, I've had enough. I'm not doing any of this anymore. And that made the invisible labour visible. And it really changed things in Iceland. The men in Iceland still call it the Long Friday, which I really like. But I think with the pandemic, as you said, Lexi, the men have been at home, and even if they've been at working, it has made some of the invisible labour visible. And our research that we've done recently has shown that men are doing more of the housework, they're doing more of the childcare, and the mothers think that this will continue after the pandemic. So I think we're in a moment actually where things are starting to shift.
Bring us back down to earth though, Stella. It's all structural, isn't it? I mean, isn't the point that even if men are the good guys, the system's not really set up to facilitate shared parenting?
Yeah, I mean, and what we expect, if we're talking about flippancy, I mean, one of the pieces of legislation I've got in mind is to ban or make it a criminal offence to use the term daddy daycare. Because I think what happens is that we lionise men who do any care at all and somehow say, isn't this marvellous? You're a new man, aren't you wonderful? Without actually asking what care needs to be done. And is it the way in which we work? And I mean, and like Jolie as well, the discrimination that I faced in my workplace for becoming a new mum came from women. It came from women telling me that I couldn't possibly make decisions about having my daughter and playing any kind of leadership role, that it was far too difficult. But nobody's ever asked that of the men around. I think there is a conversation that needs to be had about parenting and what that means and what we do to make sure that when we talk about a work-life balance, that flexible working is one of those phrases that's bandied around. It's like community organising. Nobody really knows what it means. I've certainly come to work in a different schedule as a parent in the way in which I used to work when I wasn't a parent. But I've also tried to implement that with my staff and find ways of working that work for them and the total caring commitments that they have. Too often we act as if we're doing women a favour if there might be a creche at work, for example, rather than saying, hang on a minute, are we working in the ways that work for families? That conversation at the moment is being led around women's work rather than saying it's about parenting. So you get the kind of man who boasts about having taken time off to maybe take a child out to the playground, and isn't that wonderful, and aren't they making things work? But not the day-to-day drudgery of making sure that, as you say, you can't just put a kid in a jumperoo, give him a packet of crisps and a can of Coke and say, see you in 7 hours' time. one of the things that's been really interesting about the pandemic is everyone's had this exciting conversation about technology, and, you know, you're on mute became the phrase of 2020, didn't it? But that conversation, the idea that somehow technology is going to fix this, rather than saying, why do people have to be on all the time? Or is there something about the way in which we structure work that we need to do that would make it more equal, make egalitarianism more possible? Again, it's just not a conversation that's happening. And if anything now, the push to get people back to work, and also the recognition that an awful lot of women were in jobs where you couldn't work from home. You know, they were in jobs which weren't possible to combine with family working if you had to then homeschool a child, and that's why a lot of them have lost their jobs. That's just not been part of that conversation to date. We have to make it part of that conversation, because we are going to lose those people from our workplace for good if we don't.
I really, I'm going to go to some of our readers' questions. And someone has asked, what should we be pushing employers to do? So how can we help, you know, to make that all employees to deal with the kind of balancing caring commitments with work, but also tackling their gender pay gap? I'm just going to chip in one. And at my work, when I came back from maternity leave, I pushed very, very hard with HR for everybody, when they came back from either paternity leave or maternity leave, to be given a meeting so that they could discuss going part-time if they wanted, because that was offered ad hoc, and it was only ever offered to women coming back from maternity leave. No one thought to ask the men, you know, do you want to reduce your hours? So Ortega, what can employers be doing to tackle inequality?
I mean, I think what you've just mentioned is a really good strategy, and actually treating each individual employee as an individual and trying to figure out what works for them. I think job shares are something that employers need to think about more and get more comfortable with. I know that for so many reasons, and it's for the same reasons that a lot of employers were not keen on the idea of us all working from home, and then the pandemic happened and we were all forced to work from home, and they realised, well, actually, you know, things keep going, things work. I think employers need to be similarly open-minded about different work structures. I know job sharing is something that a lot of women, I do think particularly women, but also men as well, want, but don't feel able to broach with their employer. I know when I was running Women Who, that was something that actually came up a surprising amount, people who wanted to kind of, and you know, that's kind of related to what you're saying, going part-time. It means you're going to be part-time, somebody else is going to be doing it, and it works really well when people are allowed to do it, but that's not feasible. Thinking about, you know, flexible hours, even in terms of the hours you work. If you want to do the drop-off and pick-up, not penalising people. I've observed, I remember it really made an impression on me when I was like 22, and this was my first job when I was working in a sort of marketing agency, and there was a woman who was senior to me. She was an account director, and she had a baby, and she was very clear, I'm going to come in an hour early before, you know, our start time, and I'm going to leave an hour early, and everyone knew it, and I worked on her team, and so I respect that. But I noticed that our MD would, without fail, at least 2 or 3 times a week, come over to her about 5 minutes before he knew she was really supposed to leave, or when she was packing up. Or he'd come over after she'd just left, and he'd be like, where's, you know, I asked her name. And he made it so obvious that he did not like the fact, and he made her feel like she was doing less. But actually, I think she became way more productive, because she was in the office an hour before we all were, getting, you know, started with her day without everyone interrupting and chirping in your ear, without all the emails happening. And so, you know, there was no difference at all in what I noticed working with her. But I do think that there are some really kind of retrograde attitudes on the part of employers around things like flexible working, around things like job sharing. And I don't know whether the solution is going to have to be mandated at a policy level. You know, I don't have much faith in our current government prioritizing those sorts of things, but I don't know, it's also unions. Like, if we either formally or informally kind of unionize and are collectively, you know, collective bargaining works, and if we are collectively pushing back on those things, you know, I don't know how you did it in your workplace, Lexi, but there are strength in numbers, and if it's one woman asking for a change in the way, maternity is treated, very different than if 50 women, and women who aren't even necessarily having kids, childbearing age, da 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 da, if we all band together and really kind of present these as, collective demands, I think that can also be really effective. I'm really big into the idea of unions, so that's my thing.
Stella, do we need to put more pressure on employers? Do we need more legislation? I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that we ask people to report, we make people report their gender pay gap, occasionally, but we don't make them report what they're going to do about it. They don't actually have to be taking any action at all. I mean, is that something you'd like to see change?
Yeah, I would. And I think the parallel for me is that you'll also find a lot of businesses will report about the action they're taking on sustainability. Great. We're facing a climate crisis. It needs to be something that business is part of. But that culture there that says, and we're doing it because we see it as commercially valuable, is missing from this concept of why it matters to have equality. We're being left behind. We're one of the least productive countries in the G7. It's not by accident. It's because we're not very good at recognising talent in our country and investing in it. And one of the things, as I say, that would make a difference would be to close that gender pay gap, because it would be about looking at why you're losing people from the workplace and losing that experience that comes from that. I also think we need to tackle, I was born after the Equal Pay Act was brought into this country. We still don't have equal pay in this country. So I'm with Ortega when it's about the unions, but I'm also there saying people need stronger rights. Maria Miller, who's a Conservative, brought forward a bill about addressing pregnancy discrimination, because as Jodie says, there are employers who are openly sacking women because they're pregnant and saying, oh, look, sorry, pandemic, things are different. That's not acceptable, and people don't have the rights, they don't have the access to the legal redress. And the point about those laws is it's not a nice optional add-on. It's not us being kind to mums. It's not us saying, oh, well, we want to make sure that you don't go through something difficult and awkward. It's that it makes a difference to our economy. And actually for every employer, there are lots of really good progressive employers out there, lots of employers kind of pushing the government on this, but they need everyone to be doing it. And I look at our economic competitors, and for goodness sake, California has rules about women on boards. All right, California is not some socialist utopia. If the Americans have worked out that this is good, Walmart makes an active point about women in the supply chain because they know that women are 70% of consumers, and so they know when they market products that have been made by women, they're speaking to a constituency of potential buyers for their products. In this country, again, when you talk about women in the supply chain, it is like speaking Klingon. Literally nobody's thought about these things. And I think that's the thing for me about the last year. The conversation didn't even happen, and yet we're left with the outcome of it. So we're left with people leaving the workplace. We're left with an insecure tax base, as the Women's Budget Group has pointed out. But most of all, we're left with the idea that this is somehow an issue for women to sort out, and it's about us asking nicely and us having to find ways to make things better for us, rather than it being a benefit for the whole country. I always say the whole point about equality, lads, is we're doing you a favour because we'll be a better country, we'll be more prosperous, we'll be more resilient. But that conversation isn't happening anytime soon. We can change that. We just have to get over the idea that somehow we're being difficult for asking for equality rather than different because we want the country to work better.
Do you think that universal basic income is something that we should be looking at to tackle these issues?
Well, so there's been a debate. I think what the last year has taught us is that money matters, absolutely, but in of itself, money doesn't dissolve the power inequality to decide what is important. So if you look at unpaid care, for example, women have taken on the lion's share of that. And there's a very strong economic case that you say if you pay a UBI, you would be addressing that because women would have that income basis. It wouldn't deal with the presumption that women should be doing that work. And actually what I've always wanted in life is to do my own thing and to have my family relationships work in the way that I want them to do and work for my family. I'm pretty sure my parents will say they wouldn't want me looking after them in their old age, certainly. But what we don't have is an answer to how we address that power imbalance. And what we've seen over the last year and that lack of conversation is the lack of power, particularly an issue for women from minority community backgrounds as well. So yes, look, we need to value care work, and certainly there's a case for paying it. But in of itself, that doesn't solve, frankly, the people on left and right who would say that this is about it would take kind of Marxist analysis as this is about the superstructure, and somehow if everybody has the same amount of money, men and women will be equally free. If we've learned anything over the last year, that ain't coming anytime soon, Tonto, until we change it.
I want to, because I wanted this to be a solutions event. I wanted to go to this question for finishing up on from Diana Good. She asks, what would be the single thing you think first women and second men should do to shift the balance? It's a big one. We've got a short amount of time. Jolie, go.
My goodness. I mean, the key things for me: stop modeling gender stereotypes in your own home. Make sure you're sharing things in your own home so your children are seeing them, and know what you're talking about, and have conversations with your family and friends about these issues, because you will change minds as you're having these conversations. I mean, when I started Pregnant Then Screwed, the number of really awkward conversations I had with my own parents about it was utterly shocking, but now they totally get it. So, read up on it, have the facts at your fingertips, and have these conversations with people in your family and network so you can get people on side and they understand the problem.
Ortega?
Pay transparency, especially from men. So men need to be talking to their, friends, partners, but also to their female colleagues about what they're earning and, sharing that information. I really strongly believe that pay transparency is, one of the key reasons, or the lack of pay transparency is one of the key reasons the gender pay gap continues to thrive. And I think that the onus should be as much on men if they are feminists and if they do really want to foster change, to be more open with their female colleagues about what they're earning, especially when it's a female colleague who is, doing a like-for-like job. Just have that conversation. This is when you want, and maybe you might find out, wow, okay, you're being underpaid compared to your female colleague, but I highly doubt that. I think it's more likely that will give your female colleague ammunition to go and advocate for herself. So I think there's a real moral responsibility on the part of men there.
Stella?
So I always say that you should use your platform to amplify that different is not only possible, it's better. Because right now, there's a lot of people sitting around going, oh, this is really hard, this is really difficult, long-term systemic cultural change. Nah, there are different ways that you can be in a relationship. You can be an equal parent, you can be equally paid, you can be a boss, you can choose to take time out to be with your children. I am with Shirley Williams, not Shirley Williams, sadly, who passed away, but Shirley Conran, who said that life was too short to stuff a mushroom. But I do think that life isn't too short to demand it to be better. So using your platform, which is your power, and everybody has power, not just the 650 of us in the place that looks like Hogwarts gone wrong. You can amplify the voice of brilliant women like Ortega and Jolie when they talk about this. You can also call out the men who say that this is a women's issue, or somehow say that they shouldn't be talking about this because they wanted to give space. I mean, I'm sick of men trying to give me space and therefore using that as an excuse not to do anything. But everybody has power. Everybody has a platform, no matter how big, no matter how small, to talk about what different looks like, and to say it's not enough to have an analysis that the world is unfair. We have some answers about how we can make it better. And it's about, frankly, damn time we got there.
And Diana, my one for women would be, if you decide, well, I'm a little bit echoing what Ortega said before you decide to have a baby, if you decide to have a baby, make sure you have a conversation with the person you're going to have that baby with about childcare. You would not believe the number of my friends who didn't even know whether their partner wanted to take any shared parental leave, whether they would consider going part-time, whether they even thought any of that stuff was important. So have the conversation first and make sure, and if you have the option, if you are lucky enough to qualify for shared parental leave, and as we know, only 1 in 7 people are, only 1 in 7 couples are, and many people who work in low paid and insecure work aren't. So if you have the massive privilege of qualifying for shared parental leave, make sure that you do it. And if you are a man, I would say take shared parental leave. And the single biggest thing you could do to advance gender equality as a man is go part-time when your kids are little. Because, we're seeing some movement on shared parental leave, I think, men taking maybe a month, maybe 3 months, maybe a shared month with their partner, but still very little on sharing that, hard graft of the first couple of years that Jolie talked about before. So anyway, sorry, I got slightly on my soapbox I hope nobody minds.
I love it. Absolutely love it.
Because it's the right thing, you know. Bridget, oh, I can't remember. Sorry, there's baby brain for you. Bridget, the comedian, has this brilliant routine about the ungrateful feminists. That, you know, the women who just want to say, look, you don't deserve a medal for looking after your kid. It's just the right thing to do. Maybe if we all stop lionising those who do it and start calling out those who don't, we'll change that conversation so that we're not the ones holding the baby when the baby isn't as cute and fun in the playground as they were when they first got there.
Right, I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to have to bring our event to a close. We haven't got to everybody's questions tonight. If you sent us a question and we didn't get to it, I'm really sorry. We did try. Thank you all for joining us. I hope we covered a lot of ground there, so I hope we said plenty that was interesting. Massive thanks to my panel, who are just an incredible group of women doing this hard work day in, day out. So thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for that work that you do. We'd love to get your feedback about this event. So when it ends, there's a very short survey, and it'll just pop up naturally on your screen. Please do say some nice things about us, but also if we were a bit rubbish, you can say that too. It's okay, we can take it. The feedback's really important. It helps us shape our coverage for future events at The Guardian, and it helps me become a better moderator and host if you've got anything to say about that. We've got some great Guardian Live events coming up, including evenings with authors Maggie O'Farrell and Hilary Mantel, which I will definitely be tuning in for, and an event looking at the future of the NHS, and, you know, probably something about the European Super League. So, you know, if that floats your boat, look out for that one coming up as well. All of these and more can be found at theguardian.com/GuardianLive. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you all for wanting to be part of the solution. It has been a delight to have you all. So thanks so much, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.